Everything you've been told about the Sherman tank losing to German armor is backwards. 19 brand new Panthers, fresh off German assembly lines, barely broken in, once faced a scattering of M4 Shermans, guns that couldn't punch through a Panther's front plate at any range that mattered. By the numbers, this should have been a massacre in the wrong direction. Instead, near a French crossroads town called Arracourt, the Americans broke 2 Panzer brigades in 4 days. The gun didn't change. The armor didn't change. What actually won this fight has almost nothing to do with the tank. And you're about to see exactly why. Everything you've been told about the Sherman tank losing to German armor is backwards. 19 brand new Panthers, fresh off German assembly lines, barely broken in, once faced a scattering of M4 Shermans, guns that couldn't punch through a Panther's front plate at any range that mattered. By the numbers, this should have been a massacre in the wrong direction. Instead, near a French crossroads town called Arracourt, the Americans broke 2 Panzer brigades in 4 days. The gun didn't change. The armor didn't change. What actually won this fight has almost nothing to do with the tank, and you're about to see exactly why. This isn't speculation. It comes straight from a 1946 Army ballistic study most documentaries never mention. For 80 years, the story people tell about the Sherman and the Tiger runs the same way. Thin metal skin, underpowered cannon. A tank so prone to catching fire that German soldiers supposedly called it Tommy Cooker, and British crews joked about Ronson lighters. Lights first time, every time. Hollywood ran with it. So did an entire generation of tank battle documentaries built around one image. A lone Sherman dwarfed by a Tiger, crew praying before the gun even fires. The comparison on paper wasn't flattering. The M4A3, in its most common wartime form, weighed around 31.6 tons, carried 13 to 76 millimeters of armor, and mounted a 75 millimeter gun. The Tiger's 88 millimeter gun, by contrast, could punch through roughly 190 millimeters of armor at 750 meters with its best ammunition, more than enough to open a Sherman up from nearly any range its crew could see. The Panther's front glacis ran about 100 millimeters, angled well enough that a Sherman stock 75 millimeter gun had trouble touching it outside very close range. On raw spec sheets, this was not a fair fight. It was never supposed to be. So crews tried to fix the problem the obvious way. Bolt on more steel, spare track links welded across the glacis, sandbags stacked 3 deep around the hull and turret, tied down with rope and wire. Concrete poured into wooden frames. It looked like armor. It felt like armor. General Patton reportedly reprimanded a crew over the sandbags on their tank, and by summer 1944 banned the practice outright. Because the field data told a different story than the crew's instincts did, tests exposed the problem. In one Army trial, a Sherman wrapped in concrete-filled sandbags took a bazooka round the hull. The blast blew the sandbags clean off and burned a neat hole straight through the transmission cover anyway. The spare track links were arguably worse. Track steel wasn't armor grade, and a hit against it could actually normalize an incoming round, straightening its path so it drove directly into the hull instead of skipping off the Sherman's sloped plate, canceling out the one genuine advantage the tank's shape gave it. Meanwhile, every pound of scrap metal welded to the hull dragged down the suspension, chewed through fuel, and slowed acceleration exactly when a crew needed to move fast. The sandbags stopped rifle rounds. Tank shells didn't care, and none of this was the trick. It was the wrong answer to the right question, and it's worth sitting with why an entire army full of experienced tankers reached for it anyway. When you're outgunned, the instinct is to make the box thicker. The actual fix wasn't going to come from steel at all. Start with the gun problem directly because it was real and it was worse than people usually admit. The Ordnance Department had been testing tungsten-cored high-velocity armor-piercing shots since spring 1942. But the U.S. didn't grasp until after Normandy that its existing 75mm and 76mm ammunition simply couldn't handle the newer German armor. Tungsten came from China, and China's supply lines to American factories were, to put it mildly, complicated by the small matter of a world war. Production of the resulting HVAP round for the 76mm and 3-inch guns started at roughly 1,000 rounds a month in mid-1944 and only climbed to 5-figure totals by early 1945. Set that against an army fielding tens of thousands of tanks and tank destroyers across an entire theater, and the shortage becomes obvious. One estimate puts it starkly. A 76-millimeter gunned Sherman or tank destroyer crew could expect, on average, about 1 HVAP round per month. 1 round per tank per month. That is not a war-winning wonder weapon. That is a lottery ticket you're issued once every 4 weeks, and you'd better not waste it. So if the miracle shell wasn't reliably available and the up-armored gun wasn't reliably available either, 76-millimeter armed Shermans never made up more than about 53% of the Sherman force fielded in Europe. Then something else had to be doing the actual work of keeping American tank crews alive and winning engagements. That something was written into doctrine years before anyone met a panther in a hedgerow. Here's the detail that rarely makes it into the popular telling. American armored doctrine never assumed a Sherman would beat a Tiger one-on-one. It didn't need to. Standard tactics for a 5-tank platoon facing German heavies called for one section to draw enemy fire head-on, while the other section swung wide, maneuvering to hit the German tank's flank or rear. The thin side and back armor no glacis plate could compensate for. Crews had learned by mid-1944 that their 75mm gun's shell, a stubby round barely over a foot long, wouldn't crack a Panther or Tiger's frontal armor at any practical range, but it could reliably damage the sides and rear. The tactic wasn't glamorous. It also wasn't a secret weapon in the way people imagine one. It was closer to institutional math. Never send one tank to do a platoon's job, and never let the enemy choose the angle of the fight. There's a sharper way to say what was actually happening, and it comes from how the U.S. Army structured its smallest units. Doctrine treated the tank platoon, 5 tanks, as the smallest unit ever committed to contact, even against something as minor as a single enemy half-track. Whatever showed up on the other side of the field, it was never facing one Sherman. It was facing 5, arriving from more than one direction, with the explicit job of pulling a German gunner's attention one way, while a second element got a shot at the tank's blind spot. That's the trick. Not a shell, not a weld job. A standing order that treated the entire platoon, not the individual tank, as the weapon. It sounds almost too simple to be the answer people have spent decades looking for in specification sheets. But arithmetic backs it up in a way that no single duel ever could. The numbers only make sense once you stop asking, could a Sherman beat a Tiger? And start asking, what happens when 5 Shermans, artillery, and aircraft all show up to the same fight? Arracourt, September 1944, is the cleanest test case history left behind. And it's a genuinely strange one, because the Americans mostly didn't have the wonder gun when they fought it. Between 18 and 29 September 1944, the U.S. 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A faced 2 German Panzer brigades and elements of 2 Panzer divisions near the Lorraine town of Arracourt. The division fielded about 163 tanks supporting roughly 15,000 troops, and its crews had barely fought German armor before. They'd broken out of Normandy and raced across France without meeting a serious panzer force until Lorraine. On the other side, brand new Panther tanks fresh off the factory floor. Each of the 2 German brigades fielded a battalion each of roughly 45 Panzer IVs and 45 Panthers, crewed by troops who had never trained together and commanded with what after-action reports politely called uneven coordination. Fog rolled in on the morning of the German attack and refused to lift. Heavy fog blinded both sides. The Americans couldn't call in their air support, and the poor visibility meant the Germans couldn't coordinate one unified assault, launching a series of smaller, disjointed thrusts instead. That accident of weather mattered, but it isn't the whole story, because the fighting that followed wasn't decided by aircraft at all, and that's a score. Not at first. American liaison officers and company commanders described German columns of a dozen Panthers at a time, probing toward command positions, met initially by nothing but artillery firing over direct sights before tank reinforcements could reach the line. When Sherman companies did arrive, they weren't attempting to outduel Panthers frontally. They were doing what the platoon manual said: pinning, flanking, working the angles the fog allowed. By the time the fighting from 19 through 22 September ended, Combat Command A had lost 14 M4 Shermans and 7 M5 light tanks destroyed outright, along with 25 killed and 88 wounded. Rough by any measure, but look at what it bought. Across the whole Arracourt fighting, Germans lost roughly 200 tanks and assault guns, 86 destroyed outright and 114 damaged. Out of 5th Panzer Army's regional totals of 118 Panthers, 101 Panzer IVs and 122 tank destroyers and assault guns committed to the area that September. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns the Germans threw into the week's fighting, only 62 remained operational by month's end. By late September, the 5th Panzer Army had been reduced to just 25 operational Panthers, and it kept attacking unsuccessfully for 3 more days before clearing weather and growing American air activity forced a full withdrawal toward the German frontier. 2 fresh Panzer brigades, equipped with the tank the Sherman supposedly couldn't touch, were broken as fighting formations inside 11 days by a division that had barely seen German armor before that week, using mostly the same underpowered 75mm gun that gets mocked in every documentary about this war. Arracourt wasn't a fluke either, or at least not an isolated one. It shows up in the aggregate numbers too, and the source is about as dry and credible as military history gets. In 1946, the U.S. Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory studied 30 armor-on-armor engagements fought by the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions in 1944. The 2 divisions had encountered roughly 150 Panthers across those engagements, drawn strictly from individual after-action reports rather than divisional self-reported totals, which tend to inflate. The result the study reached, a 3.6 to 1 kill ratio in the Sherman's favor against the Panther. Not parity, not a narrow squeak. A lopsided advantage running in the opposite direction from the tank's entire pop culture reputation, recorded by an Army lab with no reason to flatter its own equipment 3 years after the war had already been won. It's worth being precise about what that ratio does and doesn't prove, because it would be easy to overcorrect into a new myth here. By 1944, the Germans were fighting on the strategic defensive. Air power had shifted decisively against them, and close air support and strategic bombing had already crippled the industrial pipeline feeding parts, fuel, and ammunition to the front, meaning a meaningful share of Germany's superior tanks were sitting in repair yards or fuel-starved reserve rather than fighting at full strength. The Sherman didn't develop hidden armor-piercing powers. Its opponents were increasingly broken machines, crewed by increasingly inexperienced men, arriving in increasingly small, fuel-starved numbers, exactly the conditions Arracourt handed the 4th Armored Division on a silver platter, fog included. That context doesn't undercut the tactics point, it reinforces it. A Panther with a cracked final drive, a half tank of fuel, and a crew 3 weeks out of training school is a different opponent than the one on the recruitment poster. And doctrine built around flanking, numbers, and combined arms was designed to exploit precisely that gap between paper strength and battlefield reality. The trick was never about beating the best possible tiger in a fair fight. It was about making sure the fight was never fair, and usually wasn't fought against the best possible version of anything. When the ammunition lottery did pay off, it paid off spectacularly, and it's worth not shortchanging that side of the story either. The M93 HVAP round, once it reached a crew, left the 76mm gun at roughly 3,400 feet per second, and could punch through about 157mm of armor at 500 yards, dropping to 135mm at 1,000 yards. Numbers that would open up a Tiger's front plate at combat ranges, not just its flanks. But that round showing up in a loader's hands at all for most of the war was closer to luck than to plan. Which leaves an uncomfortable question hanging over the whole story. How many of the post-war "the Sherman was always outclassed" narratives survive contact with a lab report that says otherwise? And how many of them survive simply because a burning tank on a movie screen is a better story than a supply chain?